She knocked on my door at 11:40 on a Tuesday night with mascara halfway down her face, and before I could ask what happened, she said, "I don't want to be alone tonight." I want to be clear that this was not a request I was prepared for. I had been asleep for 20 minutes. I answered the door in sweatpants and the specific confusion of a person who has been woken by something other than an alarm, and I found Helena Cross from 2B standing in the hallway in a dress that had clearly been chosen with care for an evening that had not gone the way she'd planned. "Helena, I know it's late." Her voice did the thing voices do when someone's been crying and trying to stop. I shouldn't have come here. I'll go." She turned to go. I stepped into the hallway before she'd taken a full step. "Don't," I said. "Come in." "Hey, my name is Ryan Foster. I'm 32 years old. I'm a freelance HVAC technician, which means I fix the things that keep people's homes the right temperature, and I set my own hours, which means I am occasionally awake at 11:40 on a Tuesday, and occasionally not, depending on what the week required. I had lived in apartment 2A for 4 years. Helena Cross had lived across the hall in 2B for almost as long. We were neighbors in the specific way that develops in a building where people actually pay attention to each other. Not close friends exactly, but something more than the nodding acquaintance most apartment buildings produce. It had started small, the way these things do. She'd locked herself out during my second month in the building, standing in the hallway in pajamas at 7 in the morning, looking like she was calculating how bad her day was about to get. And I'd happened to be leaving for an early job and had a spare key the previous tenant had given the building super, which I'd kept out of habit. I let her in. She brought me cookies the next day as thanks, which felt disproportionate to unlocking a door. But I understood later that the cookies were less about the door and more about her preferred way of saying thank you for things. She had also told me early on that she'd grown up the oldest of 4 kids in a house where things were chaotic by necessity, and that the precision she brought to her work now was less a personality trait and more something she'd built deliberately, a kind of order she could control after a childhood that hadn't offered much of it. I hadn't asked for that information. She'd just offered it one evening while we were both doing laundry in the building's basement. The way people sometimes share real things in unremarkable settings because the ordinariness of the moment makes it feel safe. After that, we started noticing each other in the small ways neighbors do. She watered my plants when I traveled for work, a system we developed after I'd come home twice to find them nearly dead, and she'd offered, almost apologetically, like she was worried about overstepping. I fixed her thermostat once for an actual mechanical issue, and a second time for a noise that turned out to be nothing more than the building settling, and I had not made her feel foolish about calling me for that second one, which I think was the actual moment the friendship solidified into something neither of us needed to explain to other people. Helena was an accountant, not the kind people make jokes about. She found genuine satisfaction in the precision of it, the way a column of numbers either balanced or told you exactly where it didn't. She kept her apartment organized with the same logic, everything labeled, everything where it belonged. Spice jars alphabetized in a way I'd noticed once and never mentioned because some things are better appreciated silently. She was, by her own admission, considerably less organized about anything that couldn't be reduced to a spreadsheet. She told me once, in the casual way people reveal important things while talking about something else entirely, that she liked accounting because numbers didn't lie to you the way people sometimes did. A ledger either balanced or it didn't. There was no ambiguity in a column of figures, no wondering what someone really meant when they said something. I'd thought about that conversation more than once since, turning it over the way you do with something that explains more about a person than they probably intended. She came into my apartment that Tuesday night and sat on the edge of my couch like she wasn't sure she was allowed to actually sit on it. And I made tea because making tea was something to do with my hands while I waited for her to be ready to talk. "Bad date?" I asked, setting the mug in front of her. "The worst." She wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking from it. "My friend Priya set me up. She swore he was different. He talked about his ex-girlfriend for 90 minutes. 90 minutes, Ryan. I checked my phone twice just to confirm the timeline because it felt impossible that a person could sustain that for 90 consecutive minutes. What did he say about her? Everything. How she did things. How she didn't do things. How nothing since her had measured up." Helena's voice cracked slightly on the last part, and she pressed her lips together like she was trying to physically hold something in. And at some point I realized I wasn't even annoyed anymore. I was just sad, because I sat there thinking, this is what dating is. People measuring you against someone else the entire time, and you're just supposed to sit there and let it happen. I sat down across from her, in the chair that wasn't close enough to be presumptuous, but wasn't far enough to seem like I didn't care. "That's not what dating is," I said. "That's what dating a man who isn't over his ex is. Is there a difference at this point?" "Yes," I said. A significant one. She looked at me with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been disappointed enough times that optimism feels like a language she's forgotten how to speak. I'm 30 years old, she said. I have a good job. I pay my bills on time. I have never once missed a tax deadline. She laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. And I cannot find one person who looks at me the way Priya's husband looks at her. Like she's the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. You will, I said. You don't know that. I know you, I said. That's close enough. She looked at her tea for a long moment, turning the mug slowly between her hands, and I watched her do the thing she did when she was processing something, a kind of mental double-entry bookkeeping, weighing one side against the other before committing to a conclusion. Can I tell you something embarrassing? She said. You can tell me anything. I already watched you cry in my hallway tonight. The bar for embarrassing is fairly high at this point. That got a small laugh out of her, short, surprised, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Fair point. She looked at her tea again. I made a list, before the date, things I was hoping for, not requirements, just hopes. Things like laughs at my jokes, asks follow-up questions, doesn't check his phone during dinner. She paused. He failed all three in the first 20 minutes, before he'd even started on the ex-girlfriend material. You make lists before dates? I make lists before everything. It's a personality flaw I've made peace with. She glanced at me. Don't accountants joke about you people too? The ones who never plan anything and just see what happens? We call it flexibility. We call it a lack of preparation. But she was almost smiling when she said it. I sat down across from her, in the chair that wasn't close enough to be presumptuous, but wasn't far enough to seem like I didn't care. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face did something complicated. Not quite surprise. More like the recognition of an answer she hadn't expected to receive. Why are you being so nice about this? She said. You could have just let me leave in the hallway. Because you knocked on my door at 11:40 instead of going to your own apartment, I said. That means something. She looked at her tea. I didn't want to be alone with it. The hallway felt, I don't know, too quiet. Too much room to keep thinking about 90 minutes of someone else's ex-girlfriend. Stay as long as you need, I said. She stayed for 2 hours. We didn't talk about the date again. She'd said what she needed to say about it, and I'd learned over 4 years of knowing her that Helena processed things in bursts and then needed space to move past them rather than circle back. Instead, we talked about nothing important. A show she'd been watching, something with elaborate plotting, she insisted I needed to start so we could discuss it properly. A spreadsheet error at work that had taken her 3 days to track down and turned out to be a single, misplaced decimal. An error she described with the specific outrage of someone who took misplaced decimals as a personal affront. At some point, she asked about my work, and I told her about a job from earlier that week. An elderly woman whose furnace had been making a noise for months that she'd been too nervous to ask anyone about, afraid it meant something expensive. It had been a $40 part. The woman had cried with relief and tried to pay me for a full day's labor anyway. You let her overpay you? Helena asked. I told her the actual cost. She insisted anyway. Some battles aren't worth fighting. That's not very good business practice. No, I agreed, but it felt like the right thing to do. Helena looked at me for a moment with an expression I didn't fully understand yet, something thoughtful that she didn't elaborate on. She just nodded slowly and took another sip of tea, and we moved on to the next thing, and I didn't think much more about it until later. At some point around 1:30, she fell asleep on my couch mid-sentence, the way exhausted people do when the adult brain finally gives up trying to hold the day together. I sat there for a moment looking at her. Mascara still faintly visible despite the attempt she'd made to fix it in my bathroom mirror. Her dress slightly rumpled from the position she'd curled into, her breathing settling into the steady rhythm of actual sleep. I got up quietly and got the blanket from my closet, the heavy wool one my grandmother had made, which I kept for genuinely cold nights and had never previously used for anything resembling this purpose. I draped it over her carefully, tucking the edge near her shoulder the way you do for someone who can't tell you if you're doing it wrong. She didn't wake up. I turned off the lamp, left the kitchen light on low in case she woke up disoriented, and went to my own bed. In the morning, she was gone before I woke. The blanket was gone too. Folded, I noticed, when I checked. Not abandoned. She'd taken it with her. I didn't ask for it back. I told myself this was generosity. It might have been something else. She knocked on my door again that evening, a regular knock this time, not the desperate one from the night before. I have your blanket, she said when I opened the door. She was holding it, folded properly, looking slightly embarrassed. I don't know why I took it. I was cold on the way back to my apartment and I didn't think about it until I was already in my own bed with it. Keep it, I said. Ryan, I have other blankets. That one looks better in your apartment anyway. She looked at me, holding the folded wool, with an expression that suggested she was trying to figure out if I meant something by that or if it was just a casual offer. It was both. I hadn't fully sorted out the ratio yet. Thank you, she said, for last night, for not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer, for the tea. She paused. And apparently for blankets I just steal without noticing. You didn't steal it? I gave it. You gave it to me while I was asleep. That's different. Is it? She almost smiled, a small thing. The first genuine almost smile since she'd shown up crying 20 hours earlier. I should let you get back to your evening, she said. You don't have to rush off. She looked at the blanket in her arms, then at her own door across the hall, then back at me. I have spreadsheets, she said. Genuinely, not an excuse. I actually have spreadsheets. Spreadsheets wait. Spreadsheets do not wait, Ryan. That's the whole point of spreadsheets. They're due when they're due. I laughed. She almost laughed back. Closer this time, the gap between almost and actual narrowing. Friday, she said. If you're free, I'll bring food this time instead of crying on your couch. I look forward to the upgrade, I said. Though for what it's worth, the crying version worked out fine too. Don't make this weird, Ryan. I'm not making it weird. I'm making an observation, an accurate one. It's a little weird. A little, I agreed. She went back to her apartment, blanket in her arms. I watched her door close and stood there for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. Friday came. She brought Thai food and an actual bottle of wine, which felt like a deliberate correction from the chaos of Tuesday. And we sat at my kitchen table and ate and talked. And somewhere in the middle of the evening, I noticed I had stopped tracking whether this counted as something or just two neighbors having dinner. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Not every night, not even every week, but often enough that it stopped being notable and started being simply what we did. She brought spreadsheets sometimes and worked at my kitchen table while I did paperwork for the business. I brought my toolbox over once to fix a leak under her sink and ended up staying for dinner because she'd already started cooking by the time I finished. The blanket lived on the back of her couch now, visible through her open door whenever I passed by. Neither of us mentioned it. It had simply migrated, the way some things do, from belonging to one person's life into belonging to both. One evening, about 2 weeks in, she showed up with an actual spreadsheet. Not metaphorically, an actual laptop with an actual spreadsheet open, because she was trying to reconcile a discrepancy for a client and needed, in her words, a change of scenery to make the numbers cooperate. She sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours working through it while I did invoices for the week, and somewhere in the second hour I made more tea without being asked, and set it next to her without interrupting her concentration, and she murmured a thank you without looking up. And the whole thing felt less like two people coexisting and more like two people who had already worked out a rhythm without discussing it. Found it, she said eventually, around hour 3, with the satisfaction of someone solving an actual mystery. Someone transposed 2 digits in March, a $4,000 error hiding in a 5-digit number for 2 months. That's either very satisfying or very stressful. Both. Always both. She closed the laptop and looked at the 2 empty mugs between us. You made me tea twice tonight and didn't say anything either time. You looked busy. I was busy. That's not the point. She studied me for a moment. Most people would have asked if I wanted anything, or made a thing out of bringing it over. You just did it, like it wasn't worth commenting on. Should I have commented on it? No, she said, slower than the question warranted. I think I liked that you didn't. I didn't know what to do with that observation at the time, so I didn't do anything with it. I just nodded and let the moment pass, the way you let most moments pass before you understand what they actually were. Heads. My friend Marcus noticed before I let myself examine it directly. Marcus and I had grown up 2 streets apart and stayed close through the specific erosion that happens to most childhood friendships. Fewer calls, longer gaps, but the kind of friendship that resumes exactly where it left off whenever we did actually see each other. He came over on a Saturday to help me move a compressor unit I'd bought for a job, and Helena's blanket-related visit happened to coincide, which meant Marcus got a front-row view of something I hadn't fully named yet. She'd come by to return a casserole dish. An excuse, we both knew, since the dish could have waited until Monday, and ended up staying for 40 minutes talking to both of us about a client horror story from her accounting work. Marcus laughed at the right moments, asked good questions, and generally behaved like a man having a normal conversation with a friend's neighbor. We finished moving the compressor unit into my truck, and once Helena's footsteps had faded down the hallway and her door had clicked shut across the way, Marcus leaned against the truck bed and looked at me with an expression I recognized from 20 years of him reading me better than I wanted to be read. "So," he said, "don't. I haven't said anything yet. You're about to." He grinned, unrepentant. "She brought you a casserole dish back on a Saturday for a dish that, by your own admission, she could have returned literally any other day with zero urgency. It's a nice dish. She probably wanted it back." "Ryan." Marcus crossed his arms, settling into the specific posture he used when he wasn't going to let something go. I watched her laugh at a joke about audit deadlines. A joke about audit deadlines. Nobody laughs like that at audit deadline jokes unless they're laughing at the person who told it, not the joke itself. "You like her," he said, not a question. "She's a friend." "Ryan, what?" "You have her blanket on your couch. She has my blanket on her couch. We've established whose blanket it originally was, but ownership has transferred." "That's not what I asked." Marcus crossed his arms, settling into the specific posture he used when he wasn't going to let something go. "I asked if you like her, as in, do you want this to be more than neighbors who share blankets and casserole dishes?" I didn't answer right away. "Ryan, I don't know." "That's not true. You know, you're choosing not to say it." Marcus looked at me steadily. "I've known you since we were 9. I watched you not say things to Lindsay Park for 2 years in high school until she moved to Ohio and you spent a month being weird about it. I'm not watching you do the Lindsay Park thing again." "This isn't the Lindsay Park thing." "Then what is it?" I looked at the blanket-shaped absence on my couch, the space where it usually sat folded when it wasn't at Helena's. "She had a bad date," I said. "A really bad one. Some guy talked about his ex for 90 minutes and made her feel like she was auditioning against a ghost. And she came to my door instead of going to her own apartment, because being alone with that felt worse than knocking on a neighbor's door at midnight." I looked at Marcus. I don't want to be the next guy who makes her feel like that. If I say something and it's wrong, I become the thing she's recovering from. I'd rather be the guy who fixed her thermostat and made her tea than risk being one more disappointment in a string of them. Marcus was quiet for a moment, which from Marcus meant he was actually considering what I'd said rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking at the compressor unit like it might offer him a better argument than the one he already had. Then he looked back at me. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "You think being careful is the same as being kind. It's not. Sometimes being careful is just being scared with better manners." "I'm not scared. You're terrified. You're just calling it consideration." He looked at me. "Here's the thing, Ryan. You can protect her from becoming another disappointment by staying quiet forever, sure. But you're also protecting yourself. And eventually one of two things happens. Either you tell her how you actually feel and find out if it's mutual, or you spend the next however many years making her tea and fixing her thermostat and watching her eventually find someone else who isn't too scared to say something." I didn't have a response to that. "You like her," Marcus said again. "Just say it. At least to me. Practice." I looked at the blanket-shaped space on the couch. "Yeah," I said. "I like her." "There it is," Marcus clapped my shoulder. "Now you just have to say it to the person who actually matters." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You're just choosing to make it complicated because complicated feels safer than simple." He picked up his jacket from the back of my chair. "I've got to get going. But Ryan, for what it's worth, I haven't seen you talk about anyone the way you just talked about her in about a decade. Not since before the divorce stuff with your parents made you weird about commitment in general." "That's a low blow." "It's an accurate blow. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He headed for the door, then paused. "Just don't let this become another thing you're careful about until it's too late to be anything else." He left. I sat with that for a long time after he'd gone, turning his words over the way Helena turned over numbers, looking for where the column didn't balance. I didn't say it immediately. I want to be honest about that. Marcus's pep talk did not transform me overnight into a man capable of clean emotional declarations. I went back to my regular routine. Work, the occasional dinner with Helena, the blanket migrating back and forth between our two apartments like a small diplomatic gesture neither of us had officially named. But I noticed things differently after that conversation. I noticed how she said my name when she texted to ask if I was home. I noticed that she'd started leaving her door slightly open on evenings when she wasn't doing anything specific. The unspoken invitation of someone who wanted company, but didn't want to ask for it directly. I noticed that the casserole dish excuse had stopped being necessary. She just came over now. No pretext required. I noticed Mostly that I had started arranging my schedule around the possibility that she might knock. One Tuesday, I turned down a job that would have kept me out past 9, telling the client honestly that I had something else that evening, when the something else was nothing more concrete than the possibility that Helena might come by. She didn't that particular night, and I sat in my apartment feeling foolish about the whole arrangement, and the foolishness itself told me something I'd been avoiding admitting. Another evening, she texted to ask if I had any decongestant. She'd caught a cold, and her own medicine cabinet had come up empty. And I'd driven to the all-night pharmacy at 10:30 rather than just telling her I didn't have any, because the idea of her being sick and alone across the hall had bothered me more than the inconvenience of the drive. I'd left the medicine outside her door with a glass of water and a note that just said, "Feel better." And the next morning, she'd texted a single line, "You didn't have to do that." I'd replied, "I know." Neither of us elaborated further, but something had shifted slightly in the unspoken accounting between us. 3 weeks after Marcus's intervention, she came over on a Thursday evening, not crying this time, just normal. Work clothes, hair coming loose from whatever she'd put it up in that morning, the specific tiredness of someone at the end of a long week. "Bad day?" I asked, the same question from that first Tuesday night. "Long day, not bad, just long." She sat on the couch, in the spot that had become, without either of us declaring it, hers. A client tried to convince me that creative accounting was a legitimate category. I had to explain at length that it is not. How'd that go? I won. I always win arguments about whether something is illegal. She pulled the blanket over her lap. It was at my apartment that week, the rotation having brought it back, and looked at me. "Ryan, can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "Why do you let me do this? Come over whenever I want. No real reason most of the time. Most people would have set a boundary by now." I thought about Marcus, about 20 years of him reading me better than I wanted to be read, and about Lindsay Park, and about the specific cowardice of staying quiet because staying quiet felt safer than risking the answer. "Because I don't want a boundary," I said. "I like that you come over. I look forward to it more than I probably should for something we've never actually defined." Helena went still. The blanket, halfway up her lap, stopped moving. Helena set her mug down very precisely on the coffee table. The way she did most things, like even small actions, deserved proper placement. "Define it how," she said carefully. I had practiced this with Marcus exactly once, badly, in his garage while we worked on the compressor unit. The practice version had been smoother than what actually came out of my mouth. "I don't want to be just the neighbor who makes you tea after bad dates," I said. "I want to be the reason you don't have any more bad dates to come home from." The apartment was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a door closed, footsteps receding, the ordinary sounds of a building full of other people's lives continuing around the specific stillness of this one moment. Helena looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not the post-crying exhaustion from that first night, not the careful friendliness of the week since. Something more unguarded, like she'd set down a calculation she'd been running for a while and was finally looking directly at the answer instead of double-checking the math one more time. "That's either very romantic," she said slowly, "or it's the most elaborate way I've ever heard someone describe wanting to date their neighbor. Can it be both?" "It can be both." She pulled the blanket fully into her lap, holding it the way she had that very first morning, like something she'd decided to keep without quite admitting why. "I've been doing the spreadsheet thing about this." "There's a spreadsheet?" "There's always a spreadsheet, Ryan. I'm an accountant." But she was almost smiling now. The gap between almost and actual nearly gone. "I've been tracking it. How many times I've come over without a reason. How many times you found an excuse to fix something in my apartment that didn't actually need fixing. The thermostat was fine both times, wasn't it? The thermostat was completely fine both times. I knew that going in?" "I know you knew." She held my gaze. "The data's been pointing somewhere for a while, Ryan. I think I just needed you to say it out loud so I didn't have to be the one to present the findings. Consider the findings presented." She laughed. "The full kind now. No almost about it. The kind I'd been hearing more often over the past 3 weeks and had apparently been quietly building a case file on without telling me. The thing about the bad date, the one that started all of this, was that it had felt at the time like the worst night of a long string of disappointing nights. Helena told me later that she'd cried the whole walk home. Mascara already a lost cause by the time she reached our building, and that knocking on my door had been less a decision than an instinct. The same way you reach for the nearest solid thing when you're falling. "I almost didn't knock," she told me, weeks after that first night, The two of us on her couch this time, the blanket draped over both of us instead of just her. I stood in the hallway for almost a full minute. I told myself it was inappropriate. Midnight, unannounced. I almost just went into my own apartment and dealt with it alone, like I usually do. What stopped you? I don't know. Instinct, I guess. The same thing that made me say what I said instead of just asking if I could come in. She looked at me. I don't want to be alone tonight. I've thought about why I said it that way instead of something more practical. And I think some part of me already knew, even then, that being alone wasn't actually the problem. Being alone with you in the room felt like a different category of alone than being alone in my own apartment. I thought about that, about the version of alone that isn't really alone. The kind where someone is right across the hall and you can feel the specific safety of that proximity even through a closed door. About how some buildings are just buildings, full of strangers who happen to share plumbing, and other buildings become something else entirely because two specific people in them started paying attention to each other. For what it's worth, I said, I think the guy from that date did you a favor. 90 minutes of his ex-girlfriend probably saved you from a much longer mistake. That's a very generous way to describe a terrible evening. I'm trying it on, see if it fits better than worst night of my life. It fits a little better, she admitted, though I reserve the right to still think he's a disaster. He's absolutely a disaster. Those two things can both be true. I felt something similar, I said, watching you sleep on my couch that first night. I sat there for a while before I got the blanket, just looking at you. And I remember thinking that my apartment had never felt less empty than it did with you crying in it. That's a strange thing to find comforting. I didn't say it made sense. I said it was true. She settled closer against me, the blanket shifting with the movement. Ryan! Yeah. Are you going to make this a thing where you say something obvious like, I don't want to be alone tonight either? And try to make it sound profound because it echoes what I said that first night? I looked at her. She knew me well enough now to see it coming before I'd fully committed to saying it. That was exactly my plan, I admitted. I know. You get a specific look. What look? The one where you're about to say something you've been planning to say for a while, and you want it to land exactly right. She pulled the blanket up further, settling in. Say it anyway. I won't tell you it's not profound. I looked at her, at the blanket that had started as a small kindness on a hard night and had become something we both reached for without thinking, at 3 weeks of casserole dishes and spreadsheet visits and a friendship that had been quietly building toward this entire time. I don't want to be alone tonight, I said. Or any other night, if I'm being honest. I'd rather it be you every time. Helena was quiet for a moment, and then she reached up and turned my face toward hers, and there wasn't really anything else to say after that. Sometime later, not that night, but in the weeks that followed, once the newness had softened into something steadier, she finally explained the spreadsheet she'd mentioned that first confession evening. It was real, it turned out. A simple 2-column document. Dates she'd come over, and a note about whether there had been an actual reason. The early entries had reasons. Casserole dishes, blanket returns, a thermostat that genuinely needed attention once. By the final few entries, the reason column just said, wanted to. She showed it to me on her laptop one Sunday morning, the two of us still in pajamas at her kitchen table, and I scrolled through months of small evidence she'd apparently been quietly compiling the entire time we'd been pretending none of it meant anything. You really do account for everything, I said. I told you, numbers don't lie to you. She closed the laptop and looked at me. I just needed enough data points before I trusted the conclusion. And now the conclusion is fairly obvious. She reached over and laced her fingers through mine. The same unhurried certainty she brought to everything that actually mattered to her. Statistically significant, even. The blanket stayed mostly at her place after that, though it traveled back to mine often enough that neither of us bothered keeping track anymore. Some things stop needing a column of their own once you've stopped questioning whether they belong. Marcus came over for dinner a month later, the official kind this time, no compressor units involved, and watched Helena correct my grammar mid-sentence with the easy familiarity of someone who'd done it 100 times before and would do it 100 more. I told you, he said to me while she was in the kitchen getting dessert. Decade. Longest I've watched you not say something. You were right. I'm aware. I don't need you to tell me. I just like hearing it. He raised his glass slightly. To not being too careful. To not being too careful, I agreed, and we drank to it. And across the room I could hear Helena humming something to herself while she plated whatever she'd made. The specific sound of someone comfortable enough in a space to stop performing and just exist in it. I thought about that hallway, 11:40 on a Tuesday, mascara and a dress chosen for an evening that hadn't gone right. I thought about how something that had felt, in the moment, like the lowest point of a bad week had turned out to be the actual beginning of everything that came after. Some doors you knock on out of desperation. Some of them turn out to be exactly the right door anyway. What would you have done if your neighbor showed up at your door at midnight, heartbroken from a bad date, and the only thing she could say was that she didn't want to be alone? Have you ever found out that the person who was always just the neighbor had actually been the answer the whole time? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.